Welcome to our tonight's session, should I say, where we've invited Deputy Cian O'Callaghan, TD in Dublin Bay North, who is also the SocDem's housing spokesperson. Obviously, we're all aware that last week the government published their new Housing for All policy, something that's been awaited for quite some time now at this stage. And this evening, I suppose what we wanted to try and do was to have a look through that and get a sense of, you know, what's Cian's opinion on it and what do we think we could be doing better on and that kind of thing. We also would like for people, if they would like to please put in some questions into the Q&A, because we're going to try and keep to the first half hour or so a conversation with Cian, and then try and open it up to people if you have any questions that haven't been covered. Obviously, we can't cover everything in this first half an hour. So if there's something in particular that you'd like to ask a question on, please do feel free to throw it into the Q&A. Okay. So Housing for All, Cian, long awaited. There's a couple of, well, a lot of different points to it. I mean, it's a 40 billion plan, over 200 or nearly 300 action points involved in it. I suppose there's been quite a bit of talk about it over the last couple of days, although perhaps somewhat diminished by another story that was happening at the same time, but sure, we won't get into that. I think there's a couple of things I'd like to maybe focus in on, because we can't look at everything, obviously, but I think some of the important parts that I know that are very close to your heart too would be things around, say, affordability. We'll look at that. We'll look at renters in particular as well, and also around homelessness. So that's kind of the three themes that we'll stick to maybe for the first part. So if people have questions and answers about other parts, please do feel free to throw it into the Q&A, okay? So Cian, affordability, maybe we'll start there. So obviously there's a number of different new schemes within this particular Housing for All plan, and I guess they look and talk a lot about people maybe stuck in rent traps, that squeezed middle, those who, you know, aren't eligible for social housing but can't quite get onto or aren't eligible to get a mortgage based on house prices the way they are at the moment. Although I would say almost an obsession kind of thing with home ownership being sort of the answer to almost all the issues around the housing crisis. So maybe we'll start there. And I suppose the Housing for All seems to be basing affordability. I think this is where my major problem is around it, is around a reduction in market price. And yet we all know that affordability has to be based on what people can afford, based on people's income. And I was looking at a recent ESRI report that notes that Ireland has experienced sort of significant wage stagnation since the 2008 crash, as we all know. Home ownership rates for young adults has essentially collapsed. The report was talking about how people, say, that were born in like the 80s, 90s and noughties were the first generation of people to be officially worse off than our parents. Workers in their 20s are now earning less than they might have done if they had been doing the same job in the 90s and the noughts. Many of us are spending more than 30% of our disposable income on housing. So there's 300,000 homes promised by 2030 under this plan, and 54,000 of those appear to be for around affordable purchase and rent. There's a couple of schemes, as I've already mentioned, the Affordable Purchase Scheme and the Affordable Housing Fund. They're providing 90,000 homes, social homes, by 2030. Like, I suppose my question, first one, like, do you think these schemes are going to be helpful for people to get onto the property ladder? Will they work? What's your thoughts? I know that's a big question.
Thanks, Carly. There's a fair bit in that. So, I mean, just first you say in terms of the Housing for All plan and a lot of the issues that were kind of leaked to the media in advance, there was a fair bit of spin in that. And like most things, the spin doesn't necessarily meet, you know, reality, or doesn't quite. So big thing the government were pushing out is they were saying, look, this is going to be €4 billion a year spent on housing. And they were kind of saying, you know, presenting this as an increase. Now, the current situation, the budget on housing this year, 2021, is 3.1 billion. About 2.1 billion capital and about 1 billion current. But on top of that, there's all the lending that the Housing Finance Agency does as well, which brings it up to in and around 4 billion a year. So they made a big thing out of saying we have this €4 billion a year plan. What they weren't telling you was the expenditure when you include the Housing Finance Agency loans, which isn't exchequer funding, doesn't go through the exchequer books, is at about 4 billion a year, give or take, at the moment. So there's a lot of spin and hype on extra spending that, you know, doesn't really exist. Now, there is indications that there's about 400 million more going to go into housing after the economic summer statement that the government announced. So there is that amount. It's not insignificant, but it's not huge, and certainly not the, you know, the ESRI were talking about doubling the amount of capital expenditure on housing from 2 billion to 4 billion. So that 400 million increase, that might take it from 2.1 billion to 2.5 billion. Not insignificant, but certainly not on the scale that, you know, the ESRI, for example, we're talking about. And it's just important to make that point. And also worth saying also that at the launch and in the report, especially at the press launch, there was a lot of talk from government ministers about, you know, home ownership, and this is going to, you know, get home ownership levels back up. The actual reality on the plan, and I don't think things should necessarily be measured just in terms of home ownership. That's one way of measuring things. But the reality of the plan is, if it meets its targets and actually achieves exactly what the government is setting out to do under Housing for All, that would then mean that home ownership levels would continue to fall. So it's strange that they were talking about this will get us back to home ownership, and in fact the plan they produced won't actually do that. So that's just worth noting. On the affordability measures itself, so in the general election, Fianna Fáil and in their manifesto were very, very clear, saying, look, we need 10,000 affordable homes a year. They said, we'll deliver that if we're in government. They have the housing ministry, obviously, in government. They've made this their big, big key issue. And actually the plan they produced is saying that, well, we hope to get to a situation where we have 2,000 affordable purchase homes a year and 2,000 cost rental homes. And that's it's maxing out at that point. I don't expect that will happen next year. They're saying, you know, and then they're also calling the shared equity homes that they're going to be subsidising. They're calling those affordable, and they might be a little bit more affordable than the full market rate. They're certainly not the kind of affordable purchase homes that they've been talking about in the election campaign, or the kind of homes that are, you know, Callaghan build, where you can get maybe a 3-bed home for, you know, let's say €250,000 or thereabouts. They're more likely to, those homes under the shared equity scheme are more likely to be close to the actual price caps that are set. That tends to be what happens. That's what happened in the UK. When price caps are set, the developers aim towards those price caps in that direction. And, you know, those price caps in Dublin, for example, are about 450,000, and they go down a bit in different parts of the country, but they're not really what most people would consider affordable at all. So there is some measures there in affordability. Are they enough? No, I think they're way off the mark. They're going to be a drop in the ocean. They're not. We could be building thousands of homes a year through not-for-profits or Callaghan or whatever that would be genuinely affordable, that would meet that need. And Housing for All, while it talks about that and while it's doing a bit of that, certainly isn't doing enough.
Okay, and would you say, like, I mean, you know, the central bank, ESRI, lots of other people have talked about how these sort of shared equity schemes, in actual fact, push up house prices. I suppose your thoughts around that, and do you feel Fianna Fáil got what they wanted out of this deal?
Yeah, hard to know if they got what they wanted out of this deal. I mean, they're always going to indicate that they did. So, not a mind reader on that one. I expect. I mean, the one kind of giveaway in that is the Minister for Housing, Darragh O'Brien, did a podcast there in July, and he was talking about Housing for All. And the kind of giveaway line that he gave, he just said, "Oh, others won't think there's enough in this plan," which almost indicates that he was thinking the plan isn't doing enough. Now, he'll never say that, but if he thinks other people think the plan is insufficient, you know, why would he say that or think that? If maybe he thinks it's below what he was hoping for. But look, who knows? That's kind of only speculation. In terms of the shared equity scheme in the UK, yeah, I mean, the experience from that is it pushed up prices, and it also pushed up the profits for large developers, and that's what the evidence shows from there. And despite what's said, that the scheme here is very much based on the UK. Probably one of the key differences is it came in the UK at a time when there wasn't much housing demand, you know, after the last crash, to try and stimulate things. I don't think it's a good idea in any circumstances, but if you were to bring in a scheme like that pushes up demand, that would be the kind of time to do it. This is the worst possible time to introduce a scheme like that, when prices are rising, prices are high, and there's a huge amount of demand anyway. You don't need another scheme to stimulate demand. And I mean, interesting, the people who were lobbying for this were lobbying for it just at the start of COVID, when it was felt that demand was going to collapse and the whole construction area might collapse. And they weren't lobbying for it in the context that we're in now. So.
Okay. And I mean, I suppose another part to the Housing for All plan is, I suppose, looking to kind of do, I wouldn't say a 180 now, but a certain change in direction. Like, there's a lot of talk about providing more resources, more funding to local authorities. Do you think that's likely? And I mean, I'm a councillor on South Dublin. We've got lots of councillors around the country where it's very clear and evident to all of us that there are no public land banks essentially left at this point. There's very little land left. How are they going to be able to provide all this housing? On what land? Where is that coming from? Is there any sort of specifics within this plan that kind of outline how they're going to get around that? And of course, the how we're going to get enough construction workers, and when they're busy sort of building data centers and on other things, retrofitting homes, all of that. Like, what are they going to do? How are they going to get them?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a massive skills deficit, no question about that. I was meeting with Congress and the Plasterers Union yesterday evening, going through some of that with them, and the whole area of apprenticeships has been completely ignored really by government over the last number of years. Even though unions and that have been really highlighting that we need these, there's a big skills deficit building up, and the construction industry has been highlighting that as well. And one of the ways that could be fixed is large public procurement contracts for construction, of which the state is the big buyer of those sorts of contracts. The state could be insisting that's written into those contracts is a certain level of apprenticeships taken on, and especially in the wet trades, things like bricklaying, plastering. We've an absolute deficit there. We're at about 10% of the number of apprenticeships that we have in those areas than we would have had, let's say, in about 2004. So we're way off the skill need that's been identified there. Government have kind of shrugged their shoulders on it, said, "Oh yeah, we will support apprenticeships if there's enough, if there's enough employers putting them in place," which isn't happening. And then Housing for All is very strongly says, "Oh well, we need 27,000 extra people with skills in construction. Should we get that from migration, and that will sort it out?" Completely ignoring now that there's a lot of pressure for these skills and demand in other countries at the moment. There's a housing and kind of construction boom that's going on globally.
Like the housing costs in those countries and all of that.
Yeah. And it's a very, we wouldn't say, building homes is absolutely key to our society and economy, absolutely key. And something like nursing is absolutely key. And we wouldn't take the attitude of, "Oh, sure, we won't train our own nurses. We can get every nurse that we need in, or every doctor we need in from migration." Now, really important. Our health service will collapse without migration in terms of doctors and nurses and lots of other skills and professions. It's a really important part of it. But the idea that we'd say our entire gap is going to be filled through that, and we won't try and bother to skill that up ourselves is absolutely off the wall stuff. I mean, in terms of land banks and local authorities, and I probed Minister Housing on this because he's been talking on Housing for All, talks about there's support for local authorities if they want to buy up land. Actually, the funding that he's put in place is only for if a local authority wants to buy land that's shovel ready. So effectively, we would need to have its zoning, possibly its planning and all that. So he'll only provide funding. The department only provide funding for the most expensive type of development land.
Yeah.
Local authorities should be able to buy up agricultural land years in advance, get a pipeline of land in place. If we had a proper land development agency to do active land management, that's what it would be doing. It'd be securing that pipeline for local authorities, not for profits. So we have affordable land to ensure affordable housing and social housing in the long term. That's not what's happening. And we actually have a lot of public land that could be used for housing, social housing and affordable. What we've seen is the department pushing this thing where big public land banks held by local authorities and others is sold off to some of the larger developers, including some of the larger developers who are hoarding land. Incredibly, we're doing these deals with them. So these things are big challenges, but they could be tackled, take time, but there isn't evidence really now that the government have gotten their heads around this at all, or in my view, taking those kind of things seriously. And it's worth saying, just in terms of affordability around these things, that Ireland is in line with comparable countries in terms of construction labour costs, in fact, were a little bit lower than comparable countries. Material costs were around about the same. But what's really expensive in Ireland is all the stuff around land and land speculation and all the risk and the high finance costs that go with that. And that's one of the things that's pushing up the cost of homes for people and rents. And key, like a key thing to spot in this plan is that government are actually giving €1 billion in subsidies to private developers, new subsidies, including the shared equity scheme in the Housing for All plan. So that's where a large chunk of the extra money is actually going.
Yeah, not on actually building homes.
It could be used to directly build homes, which is a much better way to use the money. Yeah.
Okay, well, I suppose one of the, I guess, more welcome measures, I think, would be the increase in the Part 5 allocation. So for social and affordable housing, that was reduced down to 10% back in 2015, I think it was, now rising to 20%, except a last minute exemption being provided to the developers anyone who bought land between 2015 and 2021, and anyone applying for planning permission over the next 5 years, they can stay at the 10% Part 5 allocation of social and affordable housing. And I think it's reported that we could be losing out on potentially just over 10,000 affordable homes or more as a result of this. Like, what's your thoughts around it?
Yeah, it's completely unjustifiable. I mean, the key point here is that the whole issue around Part 5 and whether or not it's constitutional and legal was all settled in the courts quite some time ago. There was a Supreme Court decision in that Justice Cian ruled that it is proper for the legislature and the government through planning laws to set restrictions on land, and that no one has entitlement, whether you buy land, inherit it or whatever, no one has entitlement to expect that you can maximize your return on that without any due regard to any kind of planning laws that are set down. And that's a very clear judgment. It's unequivocal. It's been settled. That was the Supreme Court. This was contested by landowners and property developers, and it's done. So we know from that case that Part 5, and this was Part 5 at 20%, 10% social and 10% affordable, is constitutionally sound. So it appears that
within the rights to do
100%, yeah, 100%. Already been done, already established.
Decided, already done. And yet they're saying the department has given them strong legal advice to say this is impossible.
No, well, the department won't say if they actually sought any legal advice on this or not. So the assumption is that they didn't even seek legal advice on this. If they had gotten legal advice, I'm sure the legal advice presumably would have told them, no, you're okay to do this based on the Supreme Court judgment. So it is a case of the Minister for Housing, really tripping over himself to facilitate developers. And all the headlines were on, 20%, this is going to come in, it's going to apply. The expectation was it was going to apply straight away. And then there's this big exemption that means in most cases it isn't. And like, we need the affordable houses now, great, yeah, if we get them in 5-6 years time as well, but we need them now. The crisis is now. It's
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, it'd be a few years out past the 5 years ever before they'd even be built anyway. Like, so I mean, it's you're talking 8 years potentially before they might come online. Okay. Long-term leasing, Cian, you had a bill in regards to this brought forward during the last term. And I think realistically, you were the first person I ever heard talking about this outside of, the party and whatever else. Like, the long-term leasing aspect being that we would provide a 20-25 year lease to a landlord, cuckoo fund, vulture fund, whatever, for people in social housing. So the council goes into a contract with them for 25 years, whatever it might be. There is no clause within that to be able to extend that lease or whatever else. And then after that 25-year period is up, they can be out the door. You were very, very unequivocal about your displeasure and opposition to that kind of policy. They're talking about phasing this out now by 2025. What's your thinking?
Yeah, and again, the headlines were, we're ending this, we're stopping this. Then you read the plan, you see, oh, well, not till 2025, which happens to be the entire term of the government being in office. And I mean, it not only is that kind of very disingenuous, that the fact is this has really been ramped up under this government. So prior to this government taking office, yes, it was being done, but it was being done at a very small level. It was brought in when Alan Kelly was the Minister for Housing, but wasn't really utilised much. It's this government that's ramping it up, and they're giving the impression that they're stopping it, when in fact, it appears that they're going full throttle at it. And then basically they're promising, well, the next government isn't going to use it. It's exceptionally poor value for money. And if we weren't doing that, if we weren't giving those subsidies to private developers, investment funds, could be spending that on building actual homes and then owning them in the long term and in perpetuity. And of course, giving the tenants also more security as well, because if someone now goes into one of these tenancies, they don't know what will happen in 20, 25 years either. It's one of those cases where we won the arguments that they're saying they're doing it, but they're not actually doing it. And they're doing in the plan, they're basically stating the opposite of what the impression they've been given publicly.
Okay. All right, let's move on to renters. A topic kind of quite close to my heart. I'm sure there's a number of us here this evening who are renting, living in insecure tenancies and unable, don't know whether you'll be here next month, never mind next year. Very difficult to plan around all sorts of things. Incredibly high rents and all the rest of it. And I suppose the Housing for All plan is talking about indefinite tenancies for renters. I feel that there's a caveat within that. You might talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, sorry, what do you mean in terms of caveat, in terms of the indefinite tenancies, or what's
I think we're talking about how it would still not apply for the year 6 part of part 4, so you could still be out in your year after that. But there just seems to be, there's not a huge amount of detail, I suppose, there. Like, it's not something, I didn't read it and go, phew, at the end of it, for sure. I think they were talking about extending rent pressure zone protection, say, till 2024. So they're still capping that, and even with that, we know rents are still going way over. They're linking rents obviously to the harmonised index of consumer prices. I suppose that's somewhat to be welcome, but do you think that's going to make a real difference to the likes of me and others who are renting?
Yeah, well, I mean, in terms of security or tenure, I think they're doing the minimum there. So we should be moving in line with most of the Northern European countries and simply getting rid of most grounds for eviction. So the standard is you pay your rent, you're not breaking your tenancy agreement, you can't be evicted. And that recognizes that where you're renting is your home, and it's where you're raising your family, it's where it's where you're working from now, it's where you're based in terms of your local community, it's your home, and you need stability of that. It's not just some place that you can be moved on from and then you have to start all over again and then moved on again. So that's what the legal situation in a lot of other countries recognizes. Ours doesn't. So we should be removing all those grounds to evict people. If you're paying your rent, you're not breaching the tenancy agreement, that's it, it's your home, you can't be evicted. If there are problems around rent, of course, the first thing shouldn't be, well, you have to evict the tenant. There should be supports and processes to see, can payment plans be put in place, can you have mediation and avoid that. And to be, a lot of landlords, most landlords in Ireland are, own 70% only own one property, so they don't necessarily have the skills to manage a situation like that. They could find it very stressful, be worried about their mortgage repayments and all that sort of stuff. So they need, as well as the tenant, they need support in those situations to be able to help them through it and to, try and minimize the kind of conflict and fallout that happens if a tenant does fall behind. So it's very limited on that. I mean, the extension of the rent pressure zones to 2024, yeah, you would have hoped as a minimum that would be happening anyway. Yeah, the harmonized index rents is better than what was there before, but inflation now is looking, the latest figures are at almost 3%, so it's only a small
off what it will
be.
Small,
and given that rents are so high, so like these kind of measures, it's like they're doing a little bit, but they don't really want to sort it out. They're not serious about that. Yeah. And then ultimately, look, I think we need to be doing a really large amount of cost rental homes each year to create a really good alternative to the kind of build to rent and private sector, model that's being pushed.
Yeah. I was going to talk to you about cost rental as it happens. So, I mean, we had lots of pledges in different manifestos, and I mean, the Green Party in particular, cost rental almost seemed to be the mantra to all the different woes of the housing crisis. And look, I think in a sense, cost rental can be certainly a part of how we can come up with different ways to kind of help with this particular housing crisis. But what we're then reading is that they're pledging just 2,000 cost rental homes a year. And then what they're also talking about, which is just, I really still can't get my head around it. I mean, maybe you might just explain what a traditional cost rental model should be and is usually around the rest of the country, and what they're looking about putting in place here.
Yeah, so cost rental, Vienna model, or any country in the world, cost rental is you charge the rent at the cost, the not-for-profit cost that it takes to provide that home effectively. Okay, so you don't have a profit margin in it. You don't have a return for investors. Simply paying back the loan over, and usually a low interest loan, because it's a low risk type of development for a not-for-profit. You know, they know they're going to be able to fill all their homes, or there won't be a lack of demand, even if there's a recession. The COVID won't collapse. People will want these affordable rental homes. So it's low risk, so it's low financing costs. You can actually provide it a bit better value as a result. So that's how cost rental is defined anywhere. And in the world, as far as I know, up until the government's affordable housing bill, which decided to create an Irish version of cost rental that isn't actually cost rental. It is some sort of, it's defined as, you know, at least 25% below a full market rent. It actually allows for some limited profit and equity returns, and it allows for, you know, profits to be taken out of the rents and given back to investors, which is just not cost rental anywhere that I'm aware of. The Vienna model, despite what the government's saying it, is any surpluses that are produced from rents are reinvested back into the sector, you know, initially into that particular housing scheme. But, you know, if the loans are paid off, they have to be reinvested back into
something else.
And I think there's a bit of confusion around this as well, in that the not-for-profits, some of the not-for-profits in Austria are called limited profit associations. That's how they're termed. But they are what we would know as a not-for-profit. They're not some sort of a company that extracts profits. They, you know, and some of the countries have done that. That's the way they classify them, and part of that is about, you know, state aid rules and all the rest. But they're effectively what we know as a not-for-profit. They're not someone, you know, making substantial returns and giving to shareholders or anything like that. So there's that issue with it. Yeah, I mean, as you say, look, 2,000, and it looks like it's only going to be about 1,000 next year. And this was the big Green Party thing. They were saying this is going to be the big answer on housing. 2,000, of course, it's of use and it's of value, but it's just more than 300,000 households renting privately, mostly paying exorbitant rents. Most of whom will absolutely want a cost rental tenancy.
Get into cost rental, yeah.
2,000 a year, you know, we're not going to make the kind of headways that we should be. And if we were doing it at a serious scale, then these large, high risk, high cost, high end, high rent, built to rent schemes, we were doing enough cost rental, there just wouldn't be much more demand for those, and we'd see a lot of those not, and we have an oversupply of those, it seems. That's where the biggest levels of vacancy are the high end, high rent in those schemes. And of course, you know, if you're a developer and you're trying to maximize your returns, go for a high end, high rent scheme, or do you go for something that's more for the one you think you can make the most money out of? So yeah, it's great progress that we're finally, after years of talking about cost rental in this country, we're getting to the point where they're being built and offered. But the scaling up, I think, yeah, is not on the level that we need at all. And this is not a financing issue. We have access as a country to low interest, very low interest loans, especially for this low risk type of housing construction. So that's not the primary issue here. Yeah, there are constraints on how you manage your land and everything else, but they could be overcome.
Okay, yeah, no, I was very disappointed when I saw that. I suppose I'll finish up this particular part till we move on to maybe other people's questions. And just to remind everybody, like, you know, there's lots of bit different aspects we haven't touched on here, things like vacancy and Airbnb and loads of other things I can think of off the top of my head. So if you've got any questions, just throw them into the Q&A there, and I can ask him towards the end of the session. So, okay, so maybe I know it's another area that's really close to your heart, Cian. It is to me too, and that's homelessness. And I can't say, like, it's possibly the most disappointing part of the entire thing, actually. It starts off with a big bang. You know, we've got another promise to end homelessness, this time by 2030. I'm not sure how many housing plans we're at now. Is it the third or the fourth one? We've had several ministers promise this along the way, and, you know, it's only gotten worse. You know, they've talked about signing up to the Lisbon Agreement in order to eradicate homelessness, and they're saying that they're going to do this in a number of ways. And then they outline the ways, and I literally cried when I read it. It was like, what is this going to do? Like, what, like Housing First, for example, what was your take on that particular strategy, or any other their aspects that they're talking about in terms of how they're going to essentially end homelessness?
Yeah, and firstly, just maybe to say, look, that the homeless NGOs are very strong on wanting commitment in this in terms of ending homelessness, and they argue very strongly that that's really important. That if you don't even have that as a target or an aim to work towards, it's your step backwards. And that they found, when Fine Gael at a point had given up on the idea that you could end homelessness, and in fact, Vacant was normalising it, saying, "Oh, there's homelessness in every country. Sure, we're just normal. This is all normal." That was a far worse situation to be in. So it is positive to have that in the plan. The actions around it, yeah. I mean, in terms of Housing First, the plan says that over the next 5 years we'll create 1,200 new Housing First tenancies. There's an absolute consensus across the NGOs, across parties, everything else, that Housing First really works.
Yeah.
The last national implementation.
To people what Housing First is, so that everybody kind of gets a sense.
Yeah, and sorry, and this goes back to years ago. There was this idea in a lot of the organizations working with people who've lost their homes and who are experiencing homelessness. There was this idea of, well, if a person has addiction or something, we need to help them sort out their addiction. If we get that sorted out, then we can get them a good housing tenancy, and and until then they'll have to live in emergency accommodation or whatever. That idea, years ago, was kind of completely debunked, and all the evidence shows that that people are more likely to develop addictions, or they can get worse, if they lose their home, if they're living in emergency accommodation or sleeping rough, and B, the best way for people to be able to stabilize and get themselves out of those situations is if their basic needs, i.e., access to a decent home, are met. And then, it's easier to hold down a job. It's easier to, get other supports and get the value out of those. If you're in the kind of constant stress of chaos of not having anywhere with any kind of security or permanency, it's very, very hard to, manage or get out of an addiction or any other kind of, acute needs that people might have around mental health or any of these things. So that's kind of philosophy of it. It's been proven to work in other countries. It's absolute consensus on it here. There was a national plan done on it in 2018 that identified about 1,400 people experiencing homelessness with particularly acute needs. So these are people that would be sleeping rough, or might have very complex needs, may have been in and out of emergency accommodation for years. So a real priority group of 1,400 people that could really benefit with a Housing First tenancy. And terribly, that plan said we'll get a tenancy in place in the next 3 years for 660 of them. Now, how they identified such a priority group and said, well, we'll support half of them, I can't understand. This plan is promising another 1,200 Housing First tenancies over 5 years. That's only 20 extra Housing First tenancies a year. Yeah. So after all the hype, all this talk of we're putting in all these extra resources, if you take it that there is 400 million a year extra probably going to go into housing, and that all they can get out of that in terms of the people with the most acute needs in terms of having lost their home is 20 extra tenancies a year. I mean, I don't understand that. Of course, could you deliver all 1,200 tomorrow? No, it would take a bit of time and get the support staff in place and everything else. I'm not saying this is easy, but the lack of urgency on that and the lack of prioritization on it, I think is scandalous. And I mean, for example, one of the things some of the homeless NGOs were really looking for was that there would be Housing First tenancies for families that really need them, who've been maybe for years living in emergency accommodation and stuff. And that's not mentioned in the plan. They've been very strong in saying we need a youth homelessness strategy. And again, the plan gives that commitment again, just like the Programme for Government did well over a year ago. But you're kind of like, where is the
no detail
strategy? When are we going to get it? Like, what's the So
okay.
There's a little bit in it, but there could be a lot more, I guess.
Yeah, a hell of a lot more. All right, look, I think just conscious of time here, we might just move on to the Q&A session. So I'm just kind of good few bits and pieces in here. So I'm just going to focus on something here at the minute. Declan Golden is asking, is there any move to use CPO for acquisition of housing land, i.e. as in the Kenny Report 73? I know there's something there, but you might want to talk about that a little bit more, Cian.
Yeah, so I mean, they were talking about implementing Kenny style measures. That's not really the case. So they are saying they're going to introduce a land value capture tax of 50%. It's a bit like the windfall tax that the Fine Gael Labour government abolished when they were in office. That was at 80%. This would just be at 50%. So that's meant to capture the value of land when it gets rezoned or gets planning put on it. A good idea is such that that money then can then be used to pay for the infrastructure costs that the state or local authority puts in. It's at best a half measure in terms of Kenny. Kenny would have actually, is about acquiring CPO land.
Yeah.
When it's at, agricultural zoned, cut out all the speculation, put in your infrastructure and deliver the land at affordable costs so you can get affordable homes. So Kenny, much better. They've been calling it Kenny. It's a nod in the right direction. It is a sign that they're beginning to be an understanding at a kind of state level that this is an issue, that we shouldn't be one of the countries that doesn't try and address this. But I think at best it's a half.
No Kenny report, that's for sure.
No.
Okay. All right. John Breen is asking about, does the plan do anything to help provide housing for separated or divorced or single parent families? I was looking through and I did notice that there is a sort of what they call it, is it second chance or some kind of catchy title, which specifically refers to people who are maybe separated or divorced that perhaps were on a mortgage with their ex-partner, and also for people going through insolvency, which of course is, unfortunately, I'm somebody who lost their home during the crash and has gone through the bankruptcy process. I suppose it certainly caught my attention, but there didn't appear to be any further detail or any of that, or did I miss anything, Cian?
There isn't huge detail on it. It is significant though that the plan does recognise that, and I think previously that has been missing, from housing plans and that. So that is positive. I mean, one of the issues that can affect people, going through separations and stuff, they can often have particular housing needs and still be tied up on a previous mortgage and maybe not able to get out of that. So the provisos in this plan, it doesn't have an answer on that, and for people in those circumstances, it does recognise it's an issue though. So I think that is positive, all right.
Yeah,
certainly opens up, the possibility of getting kind of changes and improvements, because that is something that hasn't been properly recognised, I think, before.
Absolutely. Okay. Councillor Catherine Stucker asks, what should local authorities be doing in terms of building land banks? This is actually a really good question, particularly in say on DCC and also even in my own local authority. We're on course to run out of major sites by 2025. We are by 2028. It's extremely worrying, as the plan then seems to be to default to reliance on the private sector. How do we tackle this? Or in my case, we're sort of starting to see this reliance on building on green spaces, that kind of thing. So we talk about Kenny there and, sort of trying to buy up that agri land, but whether, where you're out of agri land, what are we looking at, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure there's a huge amount that individual local authorities can do this without having a proper, agency at a national level to do your active land management and then feed that pipeline of land. Like in the areas where there's higher housing demand, higher land costs, really the answer around this has got to be sufficient alternatives to the kind of speculative model, because that's the only there's, so I mean, the absolute start is where local authorities have some land. It should never be, sold off to private.
Well, in the first place.
Our councillors have been strong on. But it is about coming up with the alternatives in terms of cost rental, affordable purchase, and look, and also in terms of the various state lands the LDA would be looking at. But previously, those state lands would have been available for social housing as well at a decent level, whereas it's very much envisaged that social housing can be quite a small component of those state non-local authority lands. So this is an issue because I think the unwritten policy, and you won't see it referenced anywhere, but it seems to be that the thinking is in the Department of Housing that we'll do a fair bit of direct build local authority homes outside of the urban centres, and then in the urban centres it's all going to be long-term leasing, because we're not providing state lands in the urban areas for social housing. We provide it all right for affordable and cost rental, and they've been talking previously about private housing that we seem to hit that in the head now in terms of main urban areas anyway. But that is all creating issues, and that's the current trajectory, is that social housing in urban areas is going to be long-term leasing, despite what they're saying. Because if you're not providing land, where's it going to come from?
Yeah,
exactly. It can't, apart from your par fives, there is no stream for it without land, and the existing bits are being used up. Yeah.
Okay. Another good question in here, Claire McSweeney, and apologies if I'm missing. I'm going to try and see, kind of back to everybody, but Claire asks, what does Cian think of the expanded role of the LDA? You love the LDA, Cian, don't you? You're a big fan.
I love the idea of a land development agency. So, I mean, this is the key thing. Like, we do really need active land management. We need it so there's a supply of land for social housing, affordable, cost rental, to get rid of that kind of speculation and profit. And even for, if you look at this from a builder's point of view, who's trying to finance a small, medium-sized builder who wants to build housing for the market, they have huge issues in terms of trying to get access to land. They have huge issues in terms of early stage finance, the risk around it. And all that is because we've got this market-driven land approach where you have these monopolies by the big developers ready to buy up the land years in advance. There's lots of areas I'd be familiar with the edges of my constituency and stuff, where there's one person owns all the development land in the entire area. Yeah, bought it all up years ago, owns all of it, decides how quickly they want to build it out or not. And this is in several different housing schemes. Owns the entire rental properties, because after they're built, they retain ownership of them. Will tell you that when there was surplus of housing, that they drip fed new homes and rental homes
keep prices
to keep prices. They would tell you that, no bones about it. And why wouldn't they have done that? Because the system allows them to do that. We need a land development agency, but actually it would be much better to support local authorities to build, not-for-profits to build, and for the land development agency to get on with ensuring there's a supply of land, rather than having them as a kind of another developer competing with everybody else. And ultimately, one agency will only be able to manage a certain amount of projects, and is not going to be able to. They'll max out at maybe 1,000 or so homes a year, so.
Yeah.
Which is a value, but you'd be better off, getting all your local authorities, all your not-for-profits at that, and feeding the pipeline of land to them as the role. And that would be, I think, would work much better.
Yeah. I have a question. It might be sort of within the thing. It's just something off the top of my head. I suppose I'm obviously a councillor in South Dublin now, but I'm not originally from Dublin. I'm a culture. Sorry to say it now, but that's me. So rural Ireland is obviously something I care very deeply about, and there's a couple of measures within the plan itself talking about funding for the towns, trying to get the villages and towns themselves sort of rejuvenated, and people living them again. I come from a very small village where practically I'd say 90% of it at this stage is unoccupied. It's boarded up. We have all of our pubs have shut. We've lost our post office. We've lost like so many other towns and villages around rural Ireland. That it's referred to as the ghost town. Generally speaking, at this point, and it's really sad to see it. Do you feel anything concrete coming from this particular plan that will help, or is there more that we could be doing?
It's good that there's a focus on this in the plan. That is helpful. Definitely, there's a huge potential in terms of getting our villages and town centres repopulated, getting buildings already built back into use. It's environmentally much more sustainable and sound, obviously in terms of people being able to walk to school or shop, but also in terms of using existing buildings, not building new. The problem is this is mainly going to be done through subsidies, most of which would probably be will end up in the pockets of developers one way or another. So a lot of that will probably push prices up is the difficulty with that approach on it. It is the right thing to be trying to tackle. Like, I think this is, and you can see this in housing policy all over, that there's a whole range of policy mistakes made for years, and then they're corrected with another policy that may have other unintended consequences, and then you have to go and fix that. Like, a lot of this is a result of really poor planning over the years, which has actually sucked the life and the population out of town centres and villages and dispersed it further into the countryside. You even see a lot of the towns around Ireland, you know, the main streets have been killed by these kind of large out of town commercial developments that have killed the main streets. Yeah. And rather than integrating them into the main street or whatever. So that kind of really poor planning is, we're paying a huge price for it now. It is good that we're trying to move in the other direction, but we're quite like subsidies that end up with developers tend to be one of the most kind of inefficient, costly, ineffective ways of addressing a problem. You're often better off doing things much more directly. So, you know, if there was funding, for example, for approved housing bodies or not-for-profits or local authorities to, and there is a limited amount of money incidentally for local authorities to CPO vacant homes and then, you know, resell them. But it only works out at about 16 vacant homes per local authority per year. So it'd be much better off, you know, giving local authorities more resources to CPO some of these, you know, turn them around and then resell them or rent them or whatever, would probably be, you know, doing a direct approach like that would probably be much more effective.
Yeah, and it certainly has sort of Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael fingerprints all over it there. It's developer, 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 isn't it? Over and over again. Subsidies after subsidies. And speaking of subsidies, Katrina has a question there. Currently, the HAP scheme is set at levels that are way out of touch with actual rents, and then there's no recognition of the top of amounts people are paying when setting the weekly rents. Is there any change coming in this plan, and will it work?
Yeah, there's nothing specifically in terms of HAP there in the plan. They may look at it in the budget. I mean, that's creating huge problems for people. And those gaps, those margins are getting bigger all the time. Yeah. And it is, you know, a lot of people now paying 50-60% of their income on rent, and including people on lower incomes, and that's creating huge problems. So now, look, in the long term, the answer isn't increases on HAP. We have to be moving away from that. But it's short-term emergency situation that needs to be addressed. But it has to be about getting, and this is the point the ESRI were making. They were saying, look at all this current expenditure we're doing on housing. It's much better to borrow at low interest rates and
build
double.
Houses.
Yeah, and that's the thing about housing for all is, you know, if we hit 9,000, 10,000 social homes each year for the next 10 years, what happens at the end of 10 years, assuming that nobody emerges in those 10 years with additional housing needs and who need social housing supports? Mm-hmm. You still have a housing waiting list of people living in insecure HAP tenancies. So they're planning to continue the current situation. It's not being done on the scale of stage.
And very happy to sort of massage the housing figures by, you know, anybody that's moved off the housing list has moved on to the HAP.
Yes, and try and claim that's and it's not. Yeah. There's 120,000 households either in HAP or on a housing waiting list, and and again the report claims we were dropping the housing waiting list, and it's just
nonsense. Yeah, I mean, there's certainly talk in there about sort of, again, more discretion for local authority people to kind of provide for more, but as you say, it's not the long-term answer by any stretch on this. Let me see, Gavin Elliott, Housing for All is very little to say about the private rental sector. In that respect, the plan has abandoned the rhetoric, if not the reality of rebuilding Ireland. Has private rental returned to its status as the forgotten sector?
Yeah, I think Gavin's answered his question there. I mean, it's
a rhetorical question,
yeah, and it is noteworthy that there seems to be this political calculation of that everything's about home ownership, and that's so their comments at the launch were all about that. You'll notice, like, when the issue with investment funds buying up homes, it was like, oh well, don't let them touch the suburban house, you know, 3-bed house, but the apartments and stuff, sure, that's no problem. Like, that's just, renters or smaller households or whatever, like, no issue there. Like, so it seems to be deeply ingrained in the kind of Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael DNA of, it's all about, it seems to be about the kind of suburban 3-bed semi-D, or, and renters, seem not to be in the calculation the same at all, in terms of their thinking. I have to say, I don't understand why they wouldn't just get on with we eventually, as a country, we were going to have the kind of security tenure for renters that is normal in other European countries.
Yeah, I mean, surely even out of their own base have to be renting at this point. It's always going to be people in any country that's going to be renting, because that might be what suits them, might be just a college, whatever it be. The rental sector still needs to be reformed, even if it's all gung-ho for home ownership. I mean, reality is I'm renting now. In theory, I wouldn't necessarily have any issue with renting for the rest of my life if I felt I had secure tenure and that I wasn't going to get kicked out when I was 65, or what am I going to do then, that kind of way. So yeah, a lot of work to do around that. Councillor Dave Quinn asks, this is a big one. What practical steps can councillors take to advance council executives, so local authority execs, to take up state funds and build social and affordable housing? Yeah. What's the answer, Cian?
Department of Housing saying, we're supporting local authorities to do this. Now, in practice, when the local authorities engage, they go through this incredibly bureaucratic and slow process. And effectively, why you see the kind of sell-off of public lands that councils own is because the department is telling them, we're not going to fund you to build homes on it. That's what they're saying. They're basically saying, the department is saying to them, you're going to have to go to a private developer, sell that off, and get some sort of a deal for a certain amount of social and affordable homes on it. So I mean, absolutely, councillors can, raise this, interrogate it, push it, look at particular, if there's bits of land that you think are appropriate, for social housing that is in council ownership, identify that, map it out, push it, ask questions, try and push schemes forward. All that actually is useful, does work. It's slow, but it can have results. It does need to be fixed at the Department of Housing level, really, to get the kind of movement we need. But yeah, I think, and look, councillors have done that in the past. They have identified bits of land that aren't being used, would be useful for housing, and have run with it and persisted with it. And as you might identify a piece of land for something else, a community centre, or where a park needs to be developed, or whatever. But it can be good to look around your area and kind of go, what's the crack with that bit of land? Who owns it? What's happening with it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose there's an onus on us as public reps across all political parties, not just the step downs, to ensure that we're voting, we're in the right ways, that we're making it very loud and clear where we stand on these things, and holding a really strong position on that. Vacancy didn't kind of come up that I saw, so I'm going to ask. Oh, sorry, no, I'll take that back. It's kind of sort of furthering on to, I suppose I wanted to talk about the vacant homes tax and this idea that we need even more data. And Councillor Catherine Stocker asks, in my experience, local authority definitions of dereliction are a massive problem in terms of tackling the issue. Do you think this plan will go any way towards genuinely tackling vacancy and dereliction? Good question.
Yeah, just the plan doesn't go into dereliction hugely. It does talk more about vacancy, which is, it's much broader. Certainly there doesn't need to be more data. There's very strong, the National Geo Survey data on this is very strong, that there is 90,000 vacant homes in Ireland that are, and these are not the larger number, which have, very short-term vacancy or whatever. There's 90,000 where on post is not delivering post. That's what their data is. And there isn't occupants too. And vacant homes tax in other countries they don't get every vacant home into use, but they get a whole load of vacant homes into use. It does work. There's strong data from Vancouver and France on that, for example. It needs to be set at a pretty high rate. And of course, you do have to have certain exemptions, like, if someone is ill and they're gone into hospital long term or whatever, the last thing they want to be hit is with a tax on their vacant home. Wouldn't be fair. And actually, if your exemptions are fair and robust, then it means you can put quite a high and effective vacant homes tax on then that then actually works in terms of getting it. We really want to be hitting the likes of these large investment funds that have some of their apartment schemes at high rents left idle or 50% empty, and so you really want to be hitting those. And likes of Barcelona have powers where the local authority can actually seize those from the investment fund if they're not. They give them 6 weeks or whatever to rent them out, and then they say we're taking them. So I mean, you really want to be getting those. But yeah, I mean, look, there's no excuses in this. They have concrete data. They know where they need to have the exemptions. They know that from CSO. They just need to get on with this. And the dereliction kind of where the work needs to be done on a home to get it into rental use. There is that the repair and lease scheme the government has. There's buy and lease. Those kind of CPOs we were talking about, they could be useful where but need to be done on a much 16 per local authority per year isn't enough. They're the kind of ways probably to really get at dereliction. But hugely important in terms of housing, but so important in terms of for communities, the cost it has in a community to have a derelict house or vacant homes and kind of life that it sucks out of an area, and the benefits you get from that as well, and how demoralizing it is for people who have real housing needs. They see derelict or vacant homes and they're incredibly stressful and demoralizing for them. So you've all those gains if we tackle this.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to feel sorry for some. As you say, always very genuine reasons why some place is idle and whatever else. But I think any of us who've done the canvassing over the last couple of years for generals and for by-elections and for local elections, the reality is every single estate you go into, there is at least a small percentage that are empty and have been for some time. And, you then go into town and you see the tents and you see people in their sleeping bags. And, I'm dealing with people on a regular basis, as I'm sure all the public representatives here are, where they're in such just awful situations, and it can't but help sort of really kind of make you feel very angry, can't it? And for me, the idea that it's just been put off again because we need more data for a number of years is just another way of putting it on the long finger. It's kicking the can down the road, really.
And it's been floating around for years, and there was the Indicon report done years ago, so this is not new or anything like that, so there really is no excuse in this. Yeah.
Okay. Well, look, I'm very conscious it's now hit the 8 o'clock mark, and we said we were going to end up on the air, but there is one last very vital question that I think is worth the ask. When is Cian releasing a book? Thoughts on that, Cian?
Give us a year or two. I don't know.
Well, I think that's a nice way to finish it up. That's been hugely informative, Cian. I've learned a lot tonight. I hope other people listening here have also learned a lot. I know the Left Bank are recording this tonight, and it will be made available on their YouTube channel. So please go check that out and maybe share that with other people, or get them to have a look in and see. There's lots to be taken from all of that. I think that's really helpful for anybody, really. If you're talking to people, you're canvassing or you're engaging with people, it's always really good to get a good sense of like what the existing policies are, what our view is on that, and how we might have done that better. Hopefully one day we might get that opportunity, and hopefully not too much longer in the distant future. But look, for now, huge thank you to Cian and to everybody in the Left Bank who helped to organise this evening. I've really enjoyed that. I hope you guys did too. And sure, I guess we will see you again soon. So slán for now. Good luck.